Daniel had always considered himself a rational person. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of the local legends that surrounded his small Oregon town. But the night he decided to take a shortcut through Black Hollow Woods, he realized some things defy logic. The woods stretched for miles, thick with towering pines that blocked out most of the moonlight. The shortcut was supposed to save him 15 minutes, but something about it felt wrong. The silence was unsettling. Too complete. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of his boots against the damp ground. Halfway through the trail, he felt it. A presence. The kind of feeling that makes your skin prickle, your instincts scream. He wasn't alone. Daniel stopped, listening. Nothing. He exhaled and kept walking, forcing himself to stay calm. But then, a twig snapped behind him. His breath hitched. He turned, shining his phone's flashlight into the darkness. The trees cast long skeletal shadows, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Daniel quickened his pace, but every few steps he heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps following him. Not the random scurry of an animal. This was something, or someone, matching his movements. Then, in the periphery of his vision, something shifted. A shadow, tall, motionless, standing between the trees. He swung the light toward it, but there was nothing. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't imagining this. Someone was out there, watching. Panic threatened to take over, but he clenched his jaw and forced himself forward. He just had to get out of the woods. A gust of wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down his spine. The footsteps behind him grew louder, closer. Daniel turned again, his flashlight sweeping across the trees. And then, he saw it. A figure standing about 20 feet away. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, watching. His flashlight flickered, his heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Then, in the fraction of a second that his light went out, the figure vanished. Daniel stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Where did it go? His phone vibrated. A notification. An airdrop from an unknown user. He hesitated before opening it. His stomach dropped. It was a photo of him, from behind, taken just seconds ago. Daniel took off running. Branches scratched at his arms, his legs burned. But he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. The sound of footsteps chased him, matching his frantic pace. But no matter how fast he ran, the feeling of being watched never left. The path ahead twisted in strange, unfamiliar ways. It didn't make sense. He had taken this shortcut before, but now it felt endless. Then the sound changed. The footsteps weren't behind him anymore. They were beside him. To his right, just beyond the trees, the shadow moved with him. Not running, just gliding. Daniel choked back a scream, forcing himself to move faster. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he saw it. The road. Just a few more feet. But then, whispering. A low, guttural voice right next to his ear. "Don't leave yet." Daniel shrieked and stumbled onto the pavement, rolling across the asphalt. His body trembled as he turned back. The woods were still, empty, but he knew it was still there, watching. Shaking, he fumbled for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. But before he could dial, his screen lit up with another notification, another airdrop. With trembling hands, he opened it. The image sent his heart into a free fall. It was him, standing on the road, from a distance. But the angle of the photo wasn't possible, because it was taken from inside the woods, right where he had just come from, right where no one should have been. His stomach twisted as his phone vibrated again. Another image. He didn't want to open it, but he did. This time it was a selfie, not of him, but of the watcher. Its face was impossible, distorted, hollow, eyes sunken, skin stretched too tight over its skull. And yet, behind that grotesque expression, there was something even worse. It was smiling. Daniel never took that shortcut again. For days, he tried to rationalize what happened. He checked the metadata of the photos. Nothing. No explanation. No source. Just a silent record of something that shouldn't exist. But the worst part? The photos wouldn't delete, no matter how many times he tried. And sometimes late at night his phone would vibrate with another airdrop request. No sender, no details. Just one word. Open. He never did. But deep down, he knew. The Watcher wasn't done with him yet. This was The Watcher in the Woods, a story that proves that sometimes the things that watch us from the shadows don't disappear when we look away. Would you have survived this? When Olivia moved into her new apartment, she was relieved to finally have a place of her own. The neighborhood was quiet, the rent was affordable, and everything seemed perfect. But from the very first night, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague unease, like the air in the room was heavier than it should be. She brushed it off as first-night jitters. Moving was stressful after all. That night, as she lay in bed, scrolling mindlessly on her phone, a strange feeling crept over her. The feeling of being watched. Her eyes darted toward the open closet. Nothing. She exhaled, forcing a small laugh at herself. You're being paranoid. But as she turned onto her side, she heard it. A soft, barely audible shuffling sound, coming from directly beneath her bed. Olivia froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible. But it was there. A slow, deliberate movement, not the random creaks of an old apartment. Something was moving under her bed. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Slowly, she reached for her phone, switching on the flashlight. With a deep breath, she leaned over the edge of the bed and shined the light underneath. Nothing. The empty space stared back at her, dust collecting in the corners. She exhaled shakily and sat back up. Maybe she was just hearing things. But just as she settled back into her pillow, tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the underside of her mattress. Olivia's stomach lurched. She bolted upright, heart hammering. Number that wasn't in her head. Something was under her bed. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to think. Call someone? Run? Look again? Then, her phone vibrated in her hand. A text message. Her breath caught in her throat as she read it. Don't move. Her hands trembled. Unknown number. No name. Then, another text. You're breaking the rules. Her vision blurred with panic. What rules? Another message. Look again. Her entire body locked up. She didn't want to. Every fiber of her being screamed not to look. But some part of her, some deep primal instinct, told her she had no choice. Slowly, with her heart slamming against her ribs, she leaned over again. This time, she wasn't alone. A face stared back at her. Wide, bloodshot eyes, skin stretched too tight over hollowed cheekbones, a mouth that curled into an unnatural, too-wide grin. The man under her bed was watching her. Olivia gasped and jerked back, nearly falling off the bed. Her vision swam with terror. This isn't real. This isn't real. Her phone vibrated again. Now you've seen me. She scrambled out of bed, throwing herself toward the door, but it wouldn't open. The lock jammed, the knob refusing to budge. Her phone buzzed again. Too late. Then, a hand wrapped around her ankle. A scream tore from her throat as she kicked, wrenching herself free. She fell to the floor, scrambling backward. Silence. She forced herself to look. The space under the bed was empty. No man, no eyes, just darkness. Her entire body trembled. Had she imagined it? Number. She knew what she saw. She staggered toward the bedroom door, gripping the handle with shaking hands. It opened. Her lungs burned as she sprinted out, grabbing her car keys, not stopping until she was in her car. The doors locked, her breath ragged. She didn't go back that night. Or the next. A week later, she returned with 2 friends. They searched the apartment from top to bottom. No sign of forced entry. No hidden crawl spaces. No proof of anyone ever being inside. Still, Olivia never felt safe again. She barely slept, always keeping a light on, always checking under the bed. Then, one night, her phone buzzed with a single message. "You shouldn't have looked." And attached to the message, a photo of her, sleeping, taken from directly under the bed. This was the man under the bed, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most aren't just in our imagination. Would you have dared to look? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because more terrifying tales are coming. And tonight, before you go to sleep, maybe check under your bed just in case. It was past midnight when Jake found himself driving down a deserted highway, the empty stretch of road swallowed by the thick, creeping fog. The only sound was the low hum of his car's engine and the occasional chirp of unseen crickets. He had been on the road for hours, exhaustion pressing heavy against his eyelids. The GPS said there wasn't another town for miles. That's when he saw her, a lone figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. A hitchhiker. Jake slowed down, squinting through the darkness. It was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, dressed in a pale white dress. Her long, dark hair fell over her shoulders, her head tilted slightly downward. Something about her seemed off, but he couldn't just leave her out here alone. He rolled down the window. "Hey, you need a ride?" The girl lifted her head, her face finally coming into view. She was beautiful, but unnervingly pale. She didn't speak, just nodded slowly. Jake hesitated but unlocked the door. "Hop in," he said. The girl slipped into the passenger seat without a sound. The air inside the car suddenly felt colder. As he drove, Jake glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her posture stiff. She stared straight ahead, expressionless. "You got a name?" he asked. Silence. For a long moment he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, in a soft, almost whisper-like voice, she said, "Lena." Jake nodded, trying to shake the unease creeping into his gut. "Where are you headed?" Her lips barely moved. "Home." They drove in silence for miles, the fog growing thicker. Then suddenly she spoke again. "Turn here." Jake frowned. There was no street, no sign, just a narrow, winding dirt road leading into the woods. His hands tightened on the wheel. Something about this felt wrong, but he turned anyway. As they drove deeper into the trees, a house appeared through the fog, a large, decaying Victorian home, its windows dark, its wooden frame sagging with age. Jake swallowed hard. No way someone still lived here. But Lena finally looked at him. "This is my home." Jake hesitated. His gut screamed at him to leave, to turn around and never look back. "Are you sure?" he asked. Lena didn't answer. She just smiled, a strange, sad smile. Then, before he could react, she opened the door and stepped out. She walked toward the house without looking back. The fog curled around her as she reached the porch. And then, she was gone, vanished, like she had never been there. Jake's breath hitched. What the hell just happened? His hands shook as he reached for his phone, pulling up Google. Maybe the house was listed somewhere. Maybe it had an owner. As he searched, his blood ran cold. An article popped up. Tragedy on Blackwood Road. Young woman killed in car crash, 1975. Jake's stomach twisted. He clicked the link. There, staring back at him, was a black and white photo of Lena. She had died 40 years ago. And the house? It had burned down decades earlier, but Jake had just seen it, had just been there, had just given a ride to a girl who didn't exist. His heart pounded. His gaze flicked up to the house again, but it was gone. Just an empty clearing, swallowed by the fog. And on the passenger seat beside him, a single white dress folded neatly, still cold to the touch. This was the disappearing hitchhiker, a reminder that sometimes the people we see on the road at night shouldn't be there at all. Would you have stopped to pick her up?